and now they're telling me it's not Zoom, it has to be something else. So I'm always running behind.
Adriana, it's going.
Now it's good. Now it's going. I get a message.
Okay, got it.
So it sounds
Awesome.
like it is a delay. I wonder if it is just that there's something about the connection that it's taking a couple more minutes. I'm always running behind.
Adriana, it's going.
Okay, now it's muted, right? Awesome, we can get started now. Well, first, thank you everyone for being here, and our apologies for the technological issues that we have with YouTube Live. Hopefully we'll get better on that. It's a learning process. So before we get started today, I want to thank our previous speaker, Hania Brand, for her awesome talk on stress and stress transmission in social groups. We learned a lot about how stress is transmitted in social groups in birds, in captivity, and in the wild. Our next speaker is Martin Surbeck. He'll be talking about the aspects of competition and cooperation in genus fun. We hope to see you all here. It's going to be as well an awesome talk. And today we have Lucy Aplin. She's going to be talking about culture and cultural evolution in birds. Before I start, I want to introduce just a little bit Lucy. You're going to get to know her a little bit more in our seminar today. Lucy got her PhD in the Australian National University in 2014. And then she moved to Oxford, right? And also she worked there as a postdoc, and she got an awesome grant over there to start up her independent research line. And then he got a Max Planck research group leader position in 2018 at the Max Planck of animal behavior, back then the Max Planck of ornithology. And since then, she's been running the cognitive and cultural ecology lab at the Max Planck. However, Lucy is making a transition in positions. Right now, she has a joint position between the University of Zurich and the Australian National University. So she's going to be moving back and forward between Europe and Australia. Kind of a hard work to do, but we wish her the best of luck. Well, Lucy's research focuses on social learning, social network and culture, and she mostly works on wild populations, on cockatoos, as you will see, but she also does a lot of experimental work with retids. Broadly, she's interested in the interactions between cognitions, the social dynamics, and transmission of behavior. Her publication record, it's very impressive and very diverse. She publishes in journals such as Science, Nature, Current Biology, Rugby, Field Trans, Journal of Animal Ecology, and I can keep going, but I'm just going to stop there. And also, she's been awarded with different grants, fellowships, and recognitions throughout all her career. But without further ado, I just want to say, well, Lucy, thank you for accepting our invitation, and the mic is all yours.
Thanks. So let's see if we can successfully do it this time. Okay. Do you see the right screen?
Yep, you're ready.
Good. Excellent. Okay, then I will jump straight into it. Thank you very much for the introduction, Adriana. And we overlapped in the Max Planck for some of the time, so we're also personal friends. So thank you for inviting me. So I want to start by introducing you to my lab group, as they're obviously central to much of this work that I'm presenting. And in my lab group, we use a combination of observation, wild and captive experiments, and modeling to explore the interaction between cognition, social systems, and the environment, as Adriana said. And these interactions have all sorts of implications, but the one I'm going to talk to you about today is the interaction, how the interaction between these factors can lead to this emergent property we call animal culture. So for those that might not be familiar, what do I mean by this? Well, I think the easiest place to start is with humans, because cultural behaviors are, of course, ubiquitous in our life history. But while we're obviously very extreme, we're not alone. So seminal work first extended the concept of culture to the lives of other great apes, showing that multiple behaviors in their repertoire are acquired via social learning, shared in populations, and retained across generations. But we've since extended the scope of culture to sort of diverse taxa and behaviors and shown that it matters. So it shapes migration routes in animals like ungulates and birds and whales. It underlies mate recognition in some songbirds. And it even helps to buffer against extreme weather events in dolphins, amongst diverse examples. So some of these cultures have likely persisted over thousands of years, as has been shown in chimpanzee tool use. But recent work has also shown that even if they're persistent, they can be vulnerable. So in chimpanzees, in areas with more human impact, they're eroded of their cultural diversity. And this effect of human impact has been called the disturbance hypothesis, and it's thought to be related to sort of fragmented groups and reduced population sizes. So a couple of years ago, a group of us came together to argue that this means that conserving cultures matters. So cultures can be slow to develop, and when knowledge is lost, it can take multiple generations to recover, if ever, and it may need to even be retrained into populations. And this is particularly going to be the case when knowledge is held, for example, in older individuals who might also be the target of hunting. So that's one side of the coin, but we also know that cultures can be potentially important sources of behavioral flexibility, and that new cultures can emerge and change at potentially much faster rate than is possible either via genetic adaptation or individual learning alone. So this adaptive flexibility can occur via two potential routes. So the first is the emergence and spread of innovation, and this can be potentially extremely rapid within a single generation. And much of the theory that we use to study this was originally developed in economics. Second, once traits are established, they're not necessarily static, but they can change over time in a Darwinian-like manner, for example, in response to selection or neutral processes like drift. So while the theory of cultural evolution is derived originally from sort of anthropology and social sciences, we've got increasing confidence in applying much of this to non-human animals. So I'm going to talk about both of these processes using examples from my studies from two avian systems, great tits and an urban population of sulfur-crested cockatoos. So these species are both sort of Anthropocene success stories. So they're opportunistic, they're innovative, they're increasing in population size and range. The tits are a model system for evolutionary ecology, especially for experiments. And the cockatoos have complex cognition and a lifespan on par almost with humans. And this long life is really important because it means they've had less potential for genetic change in response to anthropogenic change, especially in a place like Australia where urbanization is relatively recent. This allows us to disentangle these alternative routes to plasticity. So the great tits also give us one of the first examples of an animal innovation when in 1921, the birds started to open milk bottles, and this behavior seemed to spread across Britain. So we can't say exactly what happened in this case, but we can hypothesize that the pathway might have looked something like this. So an innovation on the part of one or more individuals in response to this new opportunity, cream, social learning and diffusion through the population, resulting in a group level change that appeared to persist over multiple generations, and we could call a new cultural trait potentially. So I wanted to study this pathway, and I did this in a long-running population of great tits at White & Woods in Oxford, where I was a PhD student and later a postdoc in Ben Sheldon's lab. And I've continued this work in my time as a Max Planck group leader in this study population we established in the woods surrounding the Max Planck Institute. So in both places, we pit tag birds with leg transponders, as you can see in this little plastic leg ring, and these interface with an RFID antenna system. And this allows us to build social networks, as you can see overlaid on the map of the woodlands. There, where every dot is an individual and the lines between them, the proportion of time they've been observed foraging together, and the colors of the different network communities that we can identify. And what we find in the tits is that The networks are highly connected and fission fusion. And a series of studies by myself and others have shown that these networks have functional significance for the birds embedded in them, including that they use them to find new food sources. So using these networks, we can perform cultural diffusion experiments to test hypotheses about how innovation spread. So in this first experiment I'm going to tell you about, I captured a small number of birds from each of these different social communities and then brought them into captivity, where I trained them to access this novel resource, a puzzle box, by pushing a sliding door to the left or right. I then released them back into their social communities to act as this initial innovator. And what we found is that from a few birds trained in captivity to solve this little task, the behavior spread to hundreds of birds in the wild, the large majority of whom were using the same solving technique that the original innovators were trained on. So given there's an equally difficult, equally rewarding alternative always available, this gives us good evidence that the birds are learning by copying. So you can see here on the right, the evidence that you see a heavy, strong bias towards the side of pushing left or right that I originally introduced in each population, and that the diffusion followed these really classic S-shaped diffusion curves in the experimental populations that actually really reflect the spread of technology through human societies. So we could also follow this as it traveled through social networks. And doing this, we find a strong link between network ties and learning order. So the birds are turning red here in the order at which they acquire the behavior. And we also found that individuals were conformist in their learning. So they adopted the majority behavior. And this led to increasingly entrenched traditions for left or right that persisted over the 3 generations that we measured. So finally, not only do traditions persist over generations, they also become more refined. So within individuals, they get much faster at solving over time as they gain experience. So this is that number of solves on the X versus the time taken to solve on the Y. And this is not very surprising. This is a basic reinforcement learning curve. But the interaction between reinforcement learning and social learning meant that the populations also got faster. So birds that arrived later in the diffusion process learned a faster version of the trait, and birds also retained their skill level from winter to winter. And this had consequences for the learning experience of juveniles in the new generation. So each year, these new juveniles expressed a faster solve on their first attempt. We call this a sort of cultural legacy effect of the acquired experience of previous generations. So this work demonstrated that the spread of innovation from a small number of individuals is a realistic mechanism to establish new cultural traits in populations, and that these can persist potentially over multiple generations. But it's not straightforward. Both cognitive abilities and biases and social networks all affect the shape of the cultural outcomes that we observe. But can it assist with behavioural adaptations to novel environments? So to explore this second question, we turn to my second major study system that I mentioned, the urban cockatoos in Sydney, Australia. So let me introduce you to this study system. So we work in populations around Sydney, and before I continue, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we work. So the Gadigal people of Northern Sydney, the Dorang people of the Blacktown area, and the Darawal speaking people of Sutherland Shire and Stanwell Park, particularly acknowledging that sulphur-crested cockatoo is a culturally important species to the Darawal. So while similar to the great tits in some ways, sulphur-crested cockatoos are the opposite end of the life history spectrum. So while all parrots are relatively brainy and long-lived, cockies, as these phylogenies show, which is constructed by Simeon Smiley in my lab, are on the upper range, both for relative brain size at the top and for relative longevity at the bottom. And in our populations, only about 30% of adults breed, and birds are sexually mature till they're 7 years old. Most birds roost communally year-round in these large flocks, and in our populations, the breeding adults defend their nest hollows year-round. but hollows as close as possible to the roost appear to be preferred. So we end up with this sort of semi-colonial social structure clustered around these big roosts. So to illustrate what I mean, here are some GPS tracks around the Botanic Gardens roost of about 150 birds right next to the Sydney Opera House. Each colour is a GPS tagged bird here, all 4 breeding adults. And you can see each bird is sort of using a slice of a shared home range around a central roost site. This green male also visited the 2 neighbouring roosts, which are located on either side of the harbour here. Movements by birds in this species are incredibly regular. So this is the same bird on the same day on 2 different years at the roost site just to the north of the harbour. And you can see just how routinized its behaviour is as it goes between its nest hollow and the roost site. And co-occurrences in citizen science reports of wing-tagged birds like this one tell us that birds also retain their social associates over years. So there's a high degree of social stability. But most of our study of these birds is done at the fine scale by habituating them at these roost sites. So after we habituate the birds, we paint mark all the individuals we can get, which tends to be almost all of them, in a focal roosting group with a unique color combination. Means we don't have to catch them, which is always a really bad idea with a cockatoo because they do not like to be caught. We also then pluck a feather for sexing, weigh them on scales, and this also allows for genetic relatedness and tagging. Julia has also trained birds to a signature whistle, and we use this to census roost memberships by calling birds to the ground pre-dawn from the roost site. We can then conduct close observations of behaviour or run experiments, though it's not always clear who's observing who in the system. So what does this tell us? What does this work tell us about the social system of cockatoos? So our observations have confirmed our expectation, which is that social networks are mainly structured by roosts, leading to these very modular clustered networks. However, there's also a surprising amount of movement between and social connection between roosts, as you can see here between these 5. And birds maintain relationships across roosts. So for example, birds preferentially associate with kin and will alloprene kin and other preferred.
I lost her.
I thought it was me, but yes.
Associates that have
Same here.
dispersed to other roosts when they encounter them out when they're foraging. Social memory across different roost sites and dispersed to other roost sites. Is my internet gone a bit dodgy?
Yes.
Am I back?
You're back.
You are back.
Okay, cool. I just got a thing saying my internet was unstable, but it seems to have stabilized. Fingers crossed. Okay, so did you catch me up to my last slide? Or should I repeat myself?
I did, but I'm kind of familiar with it. So,
clustered roosts across, but also social networks that have some interconnectedness between roosts, and birds seem to have preferred associates that they retain over long periods of time, some of which are kin, but not all. So then if we move on from that, fingers crossed, we find that within roosts and with regular roost visitors, birds maintain stable dominance hierarchies. So here you can see a dominance hierarchy that's pretty linear, with older males tending to be at the top, but no relationship with body size as we can estimate by weight. So we have evidence that they interact strategically based off these hierarchies. So they always attack down the hierarchy and prefer to attack those around 10 below them. And we also have extensive allopreening networks, which is basically grooming for birds for primatologists in the audience. And birds that exchanged more aggression were also more likely to alloprene. And within allopreening interactions, the investment in the interaction by each individual depends on their relative rank. So we don't have any evidence for sort of morphological correlate with rank or a badge of status. So these interactions imply individual recognition and memory, which is pretty remarkable given that roost consists of 100 to multiple hundreds of individuals. And previous systems like this have usually been assumed, at least in birds, not to exhibit dominance hierarchies. So while cockatoos are highly social, this is quite a different social system to the open mixing populations of the great tits. There's little seasonality, long-term stability, and they seem to play parrot politics on a grand scale. So how do these networks affect how information and knowledge might move in this system? Well, I focused on this species for this project because we already knew them to be highly innovative. They're also an iconic species of high interest to local people, which allows us to use the sort of many eyes of citizen science. And through our app, we collect potential cases of behavioural innovations in this species across the wider Sydney area. So I'll just focus on one main example, which is the recent emergence of this new foraging technique, flipping bin lids, which they do when the bins are put out on the street before collection by the trucks once a week. So household bins are widespread across Australia and the world, and cockatoos are widespread across Australia, but this behaviour is not. I like to think of it as a sort of supersized version of the milk bottle innovation, but where we can actually follow the dynamics as they happen. So this behaviour was first reported to me in 2016, and then we started annual surveys in 2018. And we can see that pre-18, it's actually only occurring from these reports in 3 suburbs. But by late 19, it had spread to 44 suburbs. And our spatial network analysis strongly suggests that this spread is likely due almost entirely to social learning, except for another likely independent source of innovation up in the north of Sydney, which occurred in late 2018. Because this is indirect evidence, so to study the behaviour at the individual level, we habituated and marked the entire population of one small coastal town, which is this one right down at the bottom here. And the nice thing about this coastal town of Stanmore Park is that it's sort of in a horseshoe valley. So the birds, it's a pretty closed population. It's also a very nice place to go. So we measured social networks and kinship, and we videoed bin opening behaviour over 3 months in 2019, just before COVID. So we first observed that only a subset of the population were knowledgeable, and part of the reason for this was it's basically a male culture, and within males, only males, or mostly males higher in the dominance hierarchy, were knowledgeable. We also observed that bin opening involved 5 distinct steps, and that these might take kind of months to learn because there were more birds in the process of learning than those that were fully knowledgeable. So to give you an example, here is a bird failing at the opening stage of the first open stage. Finally, we could also see a signature of learning in the social network. So birds that were in the process of learning were more connected to fully knowledgeable birds than expected by chance. So it suggests that they basically have more opportunity to learn, and that's why they're further along. So we then compared observations in different areas, and we observed first that each of these 5 stages has various options. And this leads individuals to have distinct styles. So for example, we know that parrots are strongly lateralized, and probably because of that, birds tend to be consistent in walking down either the left rim of the bin or the right rim of the bin when they open it. But even after we account for these individual differences, we also observed spatial variation in several of these stages. For example, whether birds opened the lid by holding the handle or the rim varies by location. And this suggests that local subcultures are already starting to emerge at really kind of intriguingly local scales. So this combined with this, I think, relatively slow spread, given how advantageous this behavior is, raises 2 further questions. First, is it spreading relatively slowly because of the social structure of these birds, or because of the cognitive difficulty of the task, or the way in which birds learn? And second, does the rapid divergence into subcultures reflect a general lack of social connectivity between the roost sites, for example, caused by founder effects? So experiments can start to help us explore these questions, and we're not allowed to do experiments on introducing bin opening to new areas for obvious reasons. So I'm going to tell you about one experiment where we trained a pair of birds at each of the North Sydney roost sites I mentioned earlier to eat either red or blue dyed almonds in the shell. And it's important to note too that almonds are not native, and almond trees don't tend to grow in this area. And this did require some initial extreme aversion to accepting this novel food. Julia, who did this experiment, then made these available through food dispensers at the roost sites. And within a matter of days, the behavior spread within the 2 experimental roosts, and it had spread to the control roost on day 4, and then spread within that as well, coming from a bird that moved from one of the experimental roosts. We didn't measure social networks at the 2 external roosts of this cluster of 5, so you'll just have to take my word that the behavior arrived there after about 10 days and also spread really rapidly. And when we looked at the bird's choice to take the red or the blue almond and compared it to what it had just seen other birds do, we saw that juveniles, so birds under the age of 7, but not adults, were clearly conformist, disproportionately preferring the colors that most others had taken just before they took their selection. And this is in a real contrast to the tits, where birds tend to get more conformist as they age. So we're still trying to wrap our heads why this might be, whether it's a food effect, like in humans, young individuals are very wary of trying new food types, or whether it's something more to do with the life history of these birds, which is in such direct contrast to the tits. So even given these movements between roosts, we also started to see local differences emerging in the way in which the birds cracked open the almonds. So you can see 3 examples here of 3 alternative ways to get into them. And this was actually really surprising to me that we did see these differences, because we didn't seed these emerged naturally. And it's also only over a matter of weeks in geographically very close areas that we start to see it. So we still need to work out the exact mechanisms, do further experiments, but it illustrates how in this sort of social system, you can have both the spread of innovation, but also spatial divergence in behavior. And it's probably due to the fact that we have partially connected social networks, which are also in humans thought to be very important for both maintaining culture and the spread of new innovations. So of course, the environments can also constrain the spread of innovation. And I'd like to compare and contrast 2 examples of innovations to illustrate this effect. So first, the bin opening. This is a map here of the Sydney local government areas. Sydney Harbour's in the sort of the middle there, you can see in the white. And we know that bin opening first emerged in the south area, in this Sutherland Shire area, and with the exceptions of the temporal changes I'm going to mention, it's a largely homogeneous resource, meaning that it can hypothetically spread freely in any direction, constrained by the movement of birds or their social system. So this is in direct contrast to some other innovations we observed. So this is one we call the bubbler innovation. So here birds exploit human drinking fountains by twisting the handle with their foot and have to kind of weigh in a certain way to make it work as well, and drinking from them. And we have evidence that this behavior is extensively practiced in the areas that we have where we observe it, because we paint marked about 30 birds at one focal roost and 20 birds were observed engaging in the behavior. We also know that multiple bubblers in this local area are used, and we know it's persisted over at least the last 5 years. However, it hasn't spread beyond this local government area in red. So our working hypothesis is that this is because of resource diversity. So for example, there's over 200 water bubblers in the Sydney City Council area alone, that one in blue, but they're mostly of this design. And this is only part of the sort of bubbler diversity. So most of the installed bubblers in Parramatta City Council next to Blacktown Council are of this design. And this creates a patchwork quilt of resources. So the human regulation of this resource landscape, coupled with the birds' innovativeness and the spread of innovation, has potential in this area to create either cultural diversity or homogeneity, depending on the sort of decision-making we engage in. Okay, so the spread of innovation is one route to behavioural flexibility, but what about after cultures establish in populations? So in this second section of the talk, I want to turn to change in existing cultures. So I've already actually hinted at this because in my last example, the local subcultures that we observed emerging were probably due to neutral processes like founder effects. But what about changes in the resource landscape? So this is not purely an academic question. The bin opening actually gives us an example of this happening right now. So birds are highly selective to attacking the red-lidded bins that contain general waste. So 80% of reported attacks are on them. However, about a year ago, the Wollongong Council changed the waste management policy so that food waste is now meant to go in the garden waste bin, the green-lidded bin. And this basically changes the resource landscape in the lower half of the range where we see this behaviour. So since this happened, we've been conducting weekly surveys in, again, Stanwell Park, and we've just finished a full year of these. So we're still in the analysis stage, but what we observed was that firstly, people did put significantly more food in the green bins over time. So good, they are changing their behavior, but food is also more evenly distributed. So there's more likely to be both food in a red bin and a green bin. So there might be some compliance issues going on as well. And what this effectively means is that for the birds, there's now uncertainty as to where the food is going to be. So how do we see them respond? Well, we see significantly more attempts to open green bins over time. However, really intriguingly, successful openings are more likely to be on bins with food in them, whatever the color. So we have two hypotheses for why this might be that we want to test now. The first is that it might be that the older, more knowledgeable birds who are more practiced are sticking to the red-lidded bins, and it's the younger ones that are more likely to fail who are trying on the green bins, and that's why we see this pattern. The second hypothesis, which I think is really intriguing, is that we might be seeing birds engaging in more inspection behavior, and we're misscoring this as unsuccessful attempts. So to do this, to look at this, we need to go back to our videos and watch them much more closely, which Barbara is now engaged in. So to quickly tell you what I mean, this bird we would actually say is inspecting rather than failing. So it looks in the bin and then chooses not to open it. And that would be one way they could deal with uncertainty. So I've actually tested this sort of broad resource perturbation experimentally in the tits. So I did this by going into our subpopulations of tits where the traditions were for left or for pushing right or left had been stable for 2 generations. And I made the reward structure unequal. So the established tradition now gave a lower reward, seed, than the opposite, rarer technique. So here's a bird showing this difference. So it rejects the sunflower seed and takes the mealworm. So in the graph on the right, you can see the established traditions for left or right first, and you can see they're very strong in each of the populations, followed by the results after 3 weeks of this perturbation, when about half the population has switched their preference to the other color. But what's the mechanism in this case? So our learning models revealed that individuals actually, by and large, remained conformist. So they copied the majority, even when the majority was doing the suboptimal behavior. However, conformist learning was actually beneficial for social change in this case, because it was combined with payoff biased reinforcement learning that selects within the individual for the highest payoff behavior it's personally experienced. So basically, they get a chance to occasionally experience a high payoff behavior because of this highly fission-fusion system. So once every now and again, an individual is in a unicorn group where the majority does the high payoff rare behavior. They get that chance to copy it, personally experience that worm. And once they have, they prefer it in future. And this leads to a snowball effect with the information being picked up at increasing rates across the population. But there's still a lot of variation, as you saw in that previous graph, and this appears to be related to age. So younger individuals have a better personal updating rate after they experience social information. And as a consequence, they're more able to switch. As you can see in the second graph here, if you're 1 or 2 years old, you're very likely to have changed your preference in 3 weeks. And if you're 5 years old, you're very unlikely to have. So this experiment led us to wonder about the social and cultural cost of behavioral conservatism to populations. So to explore links between social dynamics and the rate of cultural evolution, Michael Tremento, who's a PhD in my lab, moved into the lab where we can manipulate social factors. So we used a barcode system to track the groups of wild-caught great tits in outdoor aviaries. So in this experiment, we modified the puzzle box so the door was off center. So pushing from one direction is more efficient in both time and energy than pushing from the other direction. And we started all the populations off on the inefficient solution by introducing a tutor trained on that. And once it had spread, we had 2 types of populations, those experiencing turnover and those which simulated immigration or generational turnover, and those which were static. And what we observed was that by the end of the experiment, almost all of the populations experiencing turnover had completely adopted the more efficient solution, while static groups were stuck in the inefficient tradition. And the mechanism seemed to be that naive individuals or immigrants don't innovate more, but they're more open to sampling the behavioral space. So they're more open to adopting better behaviors, kind of less stuck in their ways. And you can see this reflected in the solve speed over time. Again, time to solve on the Y and experimental day on the X. And we see that while all the populations improved in speed over time, turnover populations were initially slower, probably because each individual had less experience. But despite this, by the end of the experiment, they were significantly faster than static groups. So the information loss led to eventual information gain. Michael's extended this work with a model that uses the parameters from this experiment to ask what would happen under different turnover regimes. And he finds that it's under moderate turnover when you get the highest benefits for rates of cultural evolution. If turnover is slow, you don't see much difference from static populations. And if it's too frequent, then you have a risk through stochasticity that the behavior will go entirely extinct, in which case it's rarely re-innovated. And we saw that actually happen in one of our turnover populations in the experiment. Okay, so we have evidence from experimental work that traits can become more efficient over time via this interplay between individual reinforcement and selection. And in humans, cultural traits can also become more complex over time through cumulative cultural evolution. And one of the major ways this occurs is through what we call recombination, where different cultural lineages get kind of brought together and smooshed into something new that is then taken up. So obviously we don't see anything like cumulative cultural evolution in other animals, but we wanted to test, well, if not, why not? Are great tits capable of basic recombinatory culture? So we did this in the tits by creating a puzzle box that recombined 2 skills. Whoops, let's see if I can get, no, well, you're just going to have to imagine it. This is our recombined puzzle box. So first we introduced and diffused the original sliding door task, as you saw. So this was already in populations. And then in 3 of those populations, we introduced a new task that we call the sort of old-fashioned telephone dial task. And this showed really similar experimental diffusion curves in the two experimental populations. And again, not much spread in the control population without an introduced demonstrator, suggesting that it's probably about the same level of difficulty for social learning. We then recombined these two into a 2-action step puzzle that gave progressively higher rewards for doing both behaviors together. So if you do one of the behaviors, you get a seed. If you do two of them in any order, you get a mealworm. We then presented these to these populations. And then finally, we put it back out in another generation, but this time in this second generation, only doing everything together would give you a reward. So what did we find? Well, if knowledgeable of both the components, the birds very, very rapidly put them together personally to be able to solve this 2-action task. And then if it gave progressively higher rewards, so they were able to observe and practice individual components, they were also able to socially learn the task by socially learning each component and then putting it together. But in the second generation, where only the full task was rewarded, we found that only a really small percentage of these fully naive birds learned the complex task. And actually, the evidence suggests that they again did so by observations of sort of half solves of the single components, even though they weren't actually being rewarded. So it seems like we can have the apparent appearance of complex cultures in this species, but they're scaffolded by social learning of single step components and then asocial kind of recombination rather than social learning of complex sequences or multi-step tasks. And the consequences for cultures was that we saw this breakdown of single traditions. So there's 8 possible solving techniques for this door, 8 different ways you can do it. And we don't see local traditions in any of the areas to a single solving technique. However, we do see site-by-site differences, and this is likely because the components are socially learned, so individuals in a given area will share a subset of behaviours. So I would argue that selection for increasing efficiency is probably widespread, driven by cognitive bottlenecks that will sort of seek to compress behaviours into easier packages to learn within individuals and in the transmission process. But this sort of selection for increasing complexity in behaviour is likely to be much less common. And this evidence in TITS suggests that it's cognitively constrained and it basically needs to be scaffolded by something like active teaching. However, it's not completely absent, and our urban system in the Cockatoos provides an potential example of this, driven by human-wildlife conflict. So people don't like birds opening their bins, they cause a big mess. So in response, people have started to protect their bins. And this is actually quite a complex creative problem for the people, because they need to use a technique that might stop the cockatoos opening the bins while still making it possible for the automated arm of the bin truck to empty the bin. So there's no person running out that can take off your lock mechanism. The bin has to open when it's flipped upside down by the automated arm of the truck. So what we see is that people have come up with a whole variety of different solutions. And these range from sort of shoes in the hinges to spring-loaded locks to spikes to scary-looking rubber snakes to rocks on top. And these all effectively increase the defense of the resource. So we do have some evidence that birds can solve some of these tasks of some of these protection devices. So we wondered, could this be creating an arms race to increasing complexity? So we're all familiar with the idea of an evolutionary arms race, for example, between cuckoos and their hosts. And we're also familiar with the concept of a cultural arms race in humans, for example, the nuclear arms race. But we don't have a clear idea of what a cultural arms race would look like in animals. So we thought, well, it would probably require fulfilling 2 steps. Firstly, iterated learned behavioural change in 2 populations or species. And secondly, that these are driven in response to the other, and that both escalation and de-escalation is possible. So we also thought, as a sort of third extra step, that this could occur in two different ways. Firstly, with individual learning as an innovation arms race, or secondly, with evidence for social learning on both sides, in which case it would be a true cultural arms race. So as I mentioned, we know that birds have learned to overcome some of these defenses. So for example, here is a bird in Stanwell Park pushing a brick off a bin before it opens it. There it goes. But what about the human perspective? So Barbara conducted another citizen science survey where she asked people to describe their protection, when and why they started protecting, and whether and why they changed. And she classed bin protection methods that we observed into 4 classes, varying by effectiveness. So where something like a rubber snake on top would be no functional alteration, a rock that's not attached or a brick would be low effectiveness, shoes between the hinges that would prevent flipping would be medium, and a fixed lock would be the highest. To note, we have direct observations of cockatoos opening the 2 lowest categories, and we don't yet of the 2 highest. So she then found that suburbs and people tend to escalate to more effective measures over time. And when people shifted upwards, cockatoos defeating the measure was the most commonly cited reason they gave for doing so. People also occasionally de-escalated, and cockatoos no longer opening bins in their local area was the most commonly cited reason they gave for doing that too. So for example, this person writes, bricks seemed to work for a while, but the cockies got too clever. Neighbours on the other side of the highway suggested sticks. This is a stick behind the hinge to stop the flipping. They work. So how do people learn to protect the bins? Well, again, in this survey, 65% of them reported using social information, 60% directly referencing neighbours or someone on their street, as you can see in this quote. However, we also wanted to directly test this rather than taking their word for it. So we did direct surveys of bin protection measures in 4 suburbs. And here you can again see that Stanwell Park suburb I mentioned earlier. And what we see is that the choice of whether to protect a bin or not and what kind of protection method to use are significantly assorted by walking distance when compared to Euclidean distance. So that is, you're more likely to be similar to the house next to you on the street than you are to the house behind you. And we think this gives good evidence, although of course indirect, that people socially learn bin protection measures from their neighbours. So do we have evidence of an arms race? Well, yes and no. I think we do have good evidence from iterated behavioural change, at least one iteration in the cockatoos and multiple iterations in the humans in these 2 species, and that they are driven in response to others with de-escalation and escalation possible. What we do, we also have evidence that's socially learned on the part of the humans, and we just got a grant to look more closely to see if we can get evidence for how the cockatoos are learning these extra how to defeat protection mechanisms, so we can really answer this final question. But I would say that currently the way people are learning to protect their bins and the way they're escalating slowly over time is kind of giving the perfect learning conditions for the cockatoos to also respond with social learning. So overall, I've told you about how culture is an emergent property of the interaction between social systems, cognition, and the environment, and that it exists on the substrate of the social network and also the resource landscape. And I've also shown that changes in these factors affect the form, the distribution, the persistence of cultures, and that cultural traits aren't static, but they can change over time themselves in feedback with these. And hopefully I've also convinced you that these can have consequences for behavioural responses to changing environments. And milk bottle innovation in the tits and the bin opening in the cockatoos are just 2 examples of this. And I don't think it's an accident that these are both urban behaviors. We already know that many of the recent observable cases of rapid evolutionary change have been in response to anthropogenic drivers, particularly urbanization. And so I don't think there's a reason to think that cultural evolutionary change would be different. Urban animals also tend to exist in higher densities and move less. And just like in humans, I would argue that this is a sort of cocktail that can lead cities to become hotspots for animal culture. And this is the subject of my CERI-funded ERC grant. I'm just starting now, a 5-year grant. So if that sounds of interest to you, then feel free to approach me because I will have some opportunities coming up. With that, I'll leave it there except to acknowledge my funders and collaborators and supervisors. And yeah, thank you for listening too.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for such a great talk. I think we've learned a lot about culture and cultural evolution and both systems. Both of them are awesome. So I just posted on the chat. Please type in a question mark and I will call your name. Please don't forget to state your name and your affiliations. We're trying to build community here. And also YouTube people, please feel free to post on the chat. And we have, I think Lauren is helping us looking into the YouTube channel. If you have any questions, we'll basically repeat that over here and we relay it to Lucy. We have our...
Sorry to jump in. Would you like me to stop screen sharing or leave it up?
Oh, sure. Yes. Let's just stop sharing so we can...
Stop sharing? Okay.
Yes. Thank you, Lucy. Okay. So we have our first question coming in and it's Kaya.
Hello, that was a great talk. I'm Kaya Tambak. I'm a postdoc at Hunter College. So you mentioned the dominance hierarchies in the cockatoos. I was wondering whether great tits are more egalitarian or at least, less, if they have less extreme hierarchies, less, just weaker stratification, and whether that might have something to do with more cultural innovation or spread.
Yeah, so I should mention that the hierarchies in the cockatoos are quite shallow, even though they do exist. So they're not extremely hierarchical, let's say. But in the tits, it's a really open system. So groups remix several times a day and individuals often may not encounter each other. Their only real stable bond is with their pair. And so I think that they can have dominance relationships, but you don't get a clear, stable hierarchy. And in support of that, they're much more likely to base it off morphology. So they have these black breast stripes, and the sort of bigger the stripe, the more dominant the bird, and they'll show it off. So it's sort of like a much more immediate interaction. So I wouldn't exactly call them egalitarian, but I think they do have a very open free mixing system, and this is very conducive to spread. Although they're not beyond monopolizing resource if they can get away with it. You see plenty of aggressive interactions in that species as well.
Thank you, Kaya. Our next question comes from Eduardo.
Thank you, Eduardo Fernandez Duque from Yale University. Lucy, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. It's a little bit outside what I normally read, so I may have a very naive question. And I'm going to go back to your very first slide, the one you reminded us of the great kids learning to open the glass milk bottles in the UK. What I wanted to ask is, to what extent do we know the talk and everything we learn is about things that have had a positive outcome on their exploring? When the great kids were, for all we know now, when they learned how to break those bottles, were there any cues that they knew had a positive effect on them, or could one hypothesize that animals regularly engage in play, if you want? I mean, just doing stuff because you do stuff, and every so often we notice something that stays on time because it has a positive effect.
Yeah.
It got me thinking about play in kids. It got me thinking
Yeah.
about children and playing and really doing not doing only things for which we have a purpose, but just we never know. Was that a hypothesis for explaining the great tits originally?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I didn't really cover the sort of emergence of the initial innovation. All of my research is directed at once it emerges, how does it spread, if it does spread, and what are the consequences? But other people have focused much more on the innovation part. And I think that innovations largely probably mostly come out of error and exploration. So, and exploration can be due to play. It could just be exploration and sampling of new resources in the environment as well. But I also wouldn't discount the amount of innovation that just is driven by sort of mistake, if that makes sense, or error.
It was making me think. It was
the
making me think because
recognition of the benefit after one has experienced it, and the memory to repeat that behavior.
it just got me thinking. I mean, we are probably an audience where so many of us still have this profound respect and interest in doing pure basic science as opposed to applied. But we're also seeing this, and here you have, I mean, examples that I was wondering if they were speaking to the fact that you don't have innovations unless you just go and try stuff, you play with stuff, kind of. Thank you, that helps. Very interesting.
Thank you, Eduardo. We have a question coming from YouTube. Lauren.
Hi, Lucy. Thanks for the talk. Really interesting stuff. I have a question from YouTube from Doreen. She asks, do cockatoos breed across stable flocks despite being more stable?
They breed across? Sorry, I missed the...
Yeah, so the question is, do cockatoos breed across stable flocks despite being more stable?
Breed across. I wonder if that means disperse. So they have very, very strong pair bonds. We can't say anything in the long term because there's been no long-term studies on this species, and they're very slow breeding and long-lived. But we know that the pairs we have observed since John, my collaborator in Sydney, first started a wing tag project marking some of them, they've been in stable pairs for 10 years, breeding every year. And so I think that probably much longer. So they're pretty much always with their pair. They, however, can move between groups and between roosts at any stage of life. So they can disperse as juveniles. They can also have multiple dispersals also later in life. And breeding pairs stay with the main roost. So even though they defend their hollow, they try and nest close to the roost. And if there's no shortage of hollows, like in the more rural areas, they will spend the winter and non-breeding season with the roost. So they stay extremely social, even though they're breeding. So they're not territorial, for example, at all in any way.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to follow the second part of that question. So do you expect this species to evolve towards a gene culture coevolution system?
So if I was going to look for gene culture coevolution, which I think is fascinating, I would potentially actually look in great tits, because I think that here we've got a species which we already know there's been a lot of rapid recent evolutionary change, and they're living in really highly modified changing environments in Europe. I think there kind of are no completely natural populations of great tits. So I think there are some really potential interesting possibilities there. It's very hard to isolate this because, once you've also got the genetic change, the cultural components, I think, will become increasingly fixed, and it will be hard to identify them. But I think one recent example that has been proposed for great tits, which I would love to see more work on, is bird feeding. So we know that bird feeding is to some extent a socially learned behavior in great tits. They will not use bird feeders without first observing or being socially influenced by others to use them. And we see that in some populations of great tits where there's a lot of bird feeding occurring, like in the UK, there's been changes in the morphology of the bill to be better able to exploit bird feeders. So, I mean, that's one potential example. I don't think it's been fully explored yet, but yeah, that's where I would look, I think, in a sort of rapid generation time sort of species undergoing extreme change.
Well, thank you. I'll just say for Doreen, I'll keep an eye on, she has a follow-up question to that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, for keeping an eye on the YouTube. I'm going to skip myself and I'm going to give turn to Luca.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Yeah, hello. I'm Luca. I'm a PhD student at the University of Exeter. Yeah, thank you very much for a very fascinating talk. This is really cool science. So I was wondering, so you mentioned that there might be social stability in the cockatoos. So I was interested in whether they might still monitor each other or adjust their social ties based on who is knowledgeable and who might be a useful source of information. So is there still some fluidity so they change their associations? Thank you.
Yeah, there's absolutely fluidity and change. I think the social stability is largely to do with some underlying drivers of social association, like kin-based association. I think I haven't looked at that feedback. That would be a really cool step that I haven't taken yet, whether the social network can respond to the culture rather than just being a substrate for the culture. I'm not sure whether that's best to do it experimentally in captivity or in the wild. So yes, short answer is I don't know. Would be really, really cool if it was the case.
Thank you. Really fascinating talk.
Thank you, Luca. And we've got a question coming from Theo.
Yeah, hello. I have a question about the comparison of great tits and cockatoos. Do you see difference in the learning process and the spreading of the innovative learning in between two species, and what is the background of this? Is this an ecological background or a social background?
Yeah, so I think we do see evidence for differences in the spread patterns due to the social system, certainly, as in the great tits have a much more cis-fluid free mixing population that's almost as close to ideal free mixing as you could want. An illustration of that is the fact that we see these really nice S-shaped diffusion curves, which were developed for free mixing models where they didn't consider social structure. And I don't think we would see those same curves in the cockatoos just because the social structure wouldn't allow for a sort of ideal free mixing population. So that's the social system. The cockatoos, in terms of the social learning and cognition, we need to do much more on this, but my gut feeling is that the tits are very good social learners of simple tasks and not very good at learning complex tasks. So they have a sort of limit, while the cockatoos are clearly learning much more complex tasks, like bin opening is very complex, multiple steps. But on the other hand, the great tits are really good social learners of those simple tasks, and they're very faithful social learners. So they appear to be very good at copying and sticking to what they've learned. And you do see these stable traditions arising from that. While in parrots in general, in my guys and in other guys where they've been studied in the lab with social learning, you see much more exploratory behavior. So they'll socially learn it and then they'll immediately turn around and say, well, they're not saying, but they appear to say, oh, well, I've learned it this way. How else can I learn it? And try every other option. And it's probably because they're much less food limited than the great tits, and they're much less motivated by food. So I think that kind of gives much more a rise to possible variability in behavior, but I haven't really looked at how this yet would affect the level of the cultural behavior. I suspect we wouldn't see this variability in very complex behavior because that's much harder to turn around and change once you've learned it because you've invested so much in the learning. But I think that, yeah, I could answer this in a myriad of ways.
Thank you very much. I have one other question. May I have another question? Do you see cooperative behavior in bin opening? So it would be much easier when you do it by two cockatoos.
You'd think it would be easier, but I have several videos of birds trying to open the handle from either direction. And unless they're perfectly coordinated, it's like this sort of seesaw thing going on. It seems to be more difficult than anything. No, every observation we have of two birds on a bin, usually one's being annoying and sitting on the top and the other one has to first chase it off before it can open it, or they're doing that behavior that I've observed and it seems much more competitive. Yeah, so no evidence of cooperation as such, but plenty of tolerance. So you never see a cockatoo alone. It's always with lots of others, and they're very tolerant of others coming in and scrounging after they've opened it. It's sort of a free-for-all at that point.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Theo. And can I ask you to please introduce yourself, Theo, so we get to know you as well? You're muted.
Yeah, oh, sorry. I'm Theo Bakker. I am professor in behavior ecology in Bonn, in Germany, and also chief editor of Behavior Ecology and Sociology.
Thank you. Okay, I think our next question comes from Kaya.
I also already asked a question. Adriana, if you want to ask yours, you can go first.
Oh, don't worry, I'll go after you. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just thinking about the trade-offs between, building capacity for innovation and for cultural transmission as a species. I guess there's cognitive, energetic costs, and also individual level costs in terms of risk taking and boldness. My question is kind of vague, but how do you think about these sort of individual level traits that are required versus the group level and population level traits that are required for both rates of innovation and for cultural transmission to be, I guess, maximized?
Yeah.
And I guess I'm sort of angling at sort of, I don't want this to be like a what makes humans unique question, because they're annoying, but I just mean, like, how do these two things, the individual level and group level traits, kind of interact to potentially cross a threshold into like a feedback loop that runs away?
Yeah, fascinating question. I don't want to dip my toe into kind of cultural selection, whether we could see selection for culture to be maximized. I mean, I leave that to human people. But I can say that we see, individual and social traits that are associated with cultural species. I think, firstly, if we're going to think about the rapid transmission of behavior, then fission fusion systems are really important. And I think that's what we sort of illustrated with Michael's experiment in captivity, that you need turnover of some description, whether that's generational or fission fusion, kind of preferentially fission fusion, actually, as his later experiments have shown, because you can then also have knowledgeable individuals coming in. So I think that sort of social system is going to be very much associated with the rapid spread of innovation. I think that you were sort of on the money before. There's been a lot of argument that egalitarian species are going to be more able to rapidly and successfully transmit innovations when they arise. And then it's a kind of a question of innovativeness. And this is where I think I might differ a little bit from the sort of animal innovation literature, which has sort of argued that there's traits that predict innovativeness on the part of at the individual level, and these are really important. And I think they are important predictors, but I also think that innovations can occur extremely rarely and still result in large-scale population change if there's social learning. And so actually you don't potentially need a lot of innovations to occur to see a big effect. You just need 1 in a million in a way, you know what I mean? And that's, something that we see with the tits experimentally and also with the cockatoos. This bin opening behavior must be an extremely rare behavior to innovate, because we don't see it everywhere, despite birds and bins having interacted for decades in multiple cities and towns around Australia. So I think that's what I would kind of suggest. And then, of course, there can be a whole suite of social learning traits that can evolve, like attention to individuals or optimized strategies to have better learning outcomes. And we also expect the evolution of those, then that would depend on the system we're talking about. And then I think in terms of the long scale evolution, I'm quite a big fan of the cultural intelligence hypothesis developed by Caravan Shaikh, or the cultural brain hypothesis, that, you know, argues that you should see a feedback between the family living developmental periods and increasing reliance on an ever larger cultural repertoire that should also result in larger brain sizes, going alongside with extended lifespans, extended juvenile periods, and kind of these social systems that allow for the intergenerational transmission of knowledge. That's, I don't think, what we see necessarily in something like a great tit, and yet there can still be a strong reliance on social learning. So these are sort of complex culture versus just culture, I would say.
That's so interesting. If I can just ask for one follow-up, what are the kinds of innovation slash transmission, like stultifying aspects of the, let's say, the dominance hierarchy in the cockatoos? Like, what do you see? Is it the monopolization of the, you know, opportunities to practice and to perform the culture? Is it the fact that subordinates are not necessarily mimicked or listened to? What parts of the sort of social stratification restricted?
So I would think, so actually I would reverse that. So I think the tits are much more aggressive, and the low level of tolerance we observe in them is actually one of the main things preventing social learning. So for example, of that complex two-step task, I think if there was much higher tolerance, they would be more likely to learn it, because you need to have repeated observations at close proximity to another individual to learn complex behaviors. And we do see that in the cockatoos. Even though they have a dominance hierarchy, they're extremely tolerant. Like if you have a group of cockatoos, they will literally climb over the top of each other. And they have a lot of affiliative behaviors like allopreening. And we also see a lot of this sort of very close peering type behavior that Carolyn Shipley has described in orangutans, where they will actually tolerate other individuals sticking their bills like within 2 centimeters of the food item that they've got in their hand, in their foot, watching it very, very closely, and they'll tolerate that. And you would never see a great tit tolerate that. They have a personal space and they don't let others into it. So I think that's what it's about. It's about this close tolerance of other individuals, which allows for those individuals to engage in repeated close observation.
So interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaya. I'm going to give also opportunity to our new members of the community. So Aina, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Aina. I'm a PhD student from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Thank you, Lucy, for your talk. I really find it very interesting. And I was curious about the variability that you might find between individuals. Some might be more faster learners, others might be not so much, or their capacity to innovate might also differ between them. And I was like thinking about these two populations, that they are species in so different levels of life history, right? The great tits are more fast in the fast extreme, and cockatoos at the other. So the benefits and cost of this speed or flexibility in learning might be different. So yeah, I was thinking about the fitness effects of this flexibility between individuals.
Yeah, so there has been some other work showing, not my work, but other work showing individual variation in innovativeness that's pretty repeatable in the great tits. And that seems to come along with a bunch of other fitness benefits and fitness costs, and seems to be sort of repeatable, but also appears to be, if I remember the literature correctly, quite related to developmental differences between individuals. The diet, particularly, they were fed as chicks. The cockatoos, we don't know. We need to do much more work to look at individual differences. But I do think what's really interesting is that in both species, age comes out as a potentially really important predictor of differences in social learning. And I think that this is something I would actually predict across potentially many species. And we also know there's very strong differences in innovativeness in age as well, both in the great tits. We don't know yet that in the cockatoo, but I can tell you, for example, from Eduardo's previous question, that we see a lot of play behavior in the juveniles and much less in the adults. So we do see these sorts of exploratory behaviors in the cockatoos. So yes, I think there are individual differences in these, and that they could be the source or they could be target of selection, although I think also there's going to be developmental differences that are really important. But I also think at sort of at the wider level that there's going to be a really strong age effect, and we can probably predict which way it will go depending on the system, right? The ecology of the system.
Thank you, Aina. Okay, I don't see any other question coming, so I'm going to take my opportunity. Thank you, Lucy, for such a great talk. I'm Adriana Maldonado. I'm professor at the Universidad de Rosario in Colombia. And my question, it's related to, so the state of the cockatoos is a stable society, right? But can culture persist if we disturb the society and make it unstable, especially in human-driven environments, I guess, or I can imagine people trying to shoo the cockatoos, and I don't know how that could impact the relationships among them and how that could impact the potential of socially transmitted knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I would love to do, but I haven't been able to as yet, is look across that environmental gradient. So you say there might be more disturbance in the urban environments. I actually think it's the reverse. I think that part of the reasons the system looks so stable is that it's taken to the extreme in the urban areas. There's much higher survival in the urban areas. There's lower breeding or fewer breeding opportunities. The home ranges are smaller, the densities are higher. And that's all my gut feeling. I mean, I think that if we went out to agricultural areas, this species is still persecuted as a pest, as an agricultural pest, and legally can be culled. And I think in the areas where we see ongoing culling, we might see something quite different. Unfortunately, they're also very hard to study in those areas because if they're culled regularly, like by people, then you're not going to get anywhere close to be able to observe them. They're very, very shy. So yes, I think we would. But on the other hand, I think it depends how this instability worked, because it's going to promote some aspects of cultural evolution and cultural transmission and suppress others. So if we look at the tits, then that rate, the turnover again, was really important actually for cultural evolution. But if the rates of turnover become too high, which we could see as a sort of analogous to just general instability in the system, then we start to see the loss of behaviors because they're just lost through stochasticity and they're never reinvented because innovation's the tricky bit. Or you wouldn't have the length of time that individuals need to acquire the behaviors. They're not in the population long enough for that. So I think there's a sort of sweet spot of instability, actually, that's going to promote some sorts of culture and cultural evolution. We could have another whole debate, and it probably requires another whole model as to whether that would also promote complex culture or whether you needed more stability for complex culture.
So we could think about tipping points there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But again, I think it's going to depend on the cultural trait in question. Maybe it's going to make some cultures harder to retain, but actually promote other behaviors. Like a
awesome.
5-dimensional axes or something.
Great, thank you, Lucy. We have another question coming, Suleima.
Yes, hi. I'm Suleima Tang Martinez from the University of Missouri in St. Louis. I'm retired. And Lucy, I just loved your talk. I thought it was really clear and well organized, and the information was just totally fascinating. So thank you very much for agreeing to present. I have two questions. The first question is whether you have seen any evidence either in the tits or in the cockatoos of certain individuals being more likely to innovate. So for example, are there any individuals that have come up with different innovations? I realize it's rare, that innovations are probably rare, but I was just wondering if some individuals are more likely to innovate. And then I'll wait for my second question afterwards.
I think there are individual differences, and it's probably related to things like risk taking, even more than cognition would be my guess. But I haven't looked at this specifically because I tend to sort of ask what happens once the innovation has arisen. But like you say, it usually has to be done through a sort of proxy, like problem solving, because natural innovations are so rare to observe. And this is the real challenge. I do want to look at this more in the cockatoos, and it's because I have this sort of gut feeling. This is like into wild speculation time, but I have a gut feeling that if, for example, you look at where we have seen these innovations emerge, like there's 2 locations in Sydney, we seem to have an independent emergence of the bin opening behaviour, and there's another coastal town which is scarily similar to Stanmore Park down in Victoria, a long way away in another state, where it's also emerged. And I feel like all of these places are places where you have the suburbs and they meet a natural wilderness area. So there's a real edge. That's an N of 3. But that's my gut feeling, and I really want to explore that by looking at spatial differences in innovation rates. What I don't know is whether that would be driven by the environment or driven by the social factors. So we've done some modeling work with Damien Froon and Richard Cantor in the past, where we show that the most important predictor of innovation rates is population size, basically, because every individual you add in a population, your probability of an innovation emerging in that population just increases exponentially. Even if all individuals are just clones of each other and its innovations are just mistakes. So I think that's also going to be a really important predictor. So yes, that's what I would say, that we haven't looked so much at individual level differences, but I wonder how much influence there is of individual level differences compared to these wider influences of environments or social or population dynamics.
Great, thanks. And then my second question, I realize is going to be super speculative because it really doesn't have to do with learning, but you mentioned something that really caught my attention. If I understood you, you said that those individuals that in the cockatoos that are involved in more aggressive interactions also tend to alloprene more. And then, is that correct? Okay. And then also that alloprening is considered an affiliative behavior. And so I was wondering if the alloprening may be serving as a sort of reconciliation behavior, like they fight and then they make up later by alloprening. And, we see this in some other taxa, and I was just wondering if anybody has looked at this or if you've given that any thought, because I thought it was really interesting when you mentioned that.
Yeah, so actually the PhD who was working on that, Julia Pendorf, she's very interested in social cognition. She has a primatology background, and she wants to look at this in her postdoc to ask, what is the social cognition involved in these groups, and are we seeing something more like a primate system where, for example, there's a sort of barter system of allopreening, or it's used for reconciliation, as you mentioned. Another thing we thought might be going on is that individuals might sort of be exchanging allopreening for tolerance, even maybe before the aggressive interaction happens. But we need to collect much more data and many more observations before we can really see what's going on there. But it does look like there is some link to aggression in some way. It's a sort of surprising link that the more aggressive interactions you exchange, the more affiliative interactions you also exchange, even when controlling for overall social network associations. So I think there is something like what you suggest going on. We just haven't shown exactly what yet. hopefully at some point in the next couple of years.
Okay, thanks. It's really cool. Somebody's going to look at it. So I'm glad that you have a postdoc who's going to be doing that. Thanks so much.
Me too. Thanks.
Thank you, Suleima. Well, I don't see any other questions coming. I don't know if there's anything on YouTube, Lauren. No. Okay. Do we want to close the YouTube live now? If that's the case, then I'll thank again Lucy for accepting our invitation and giving us such a great talk, and everyone else for joining us together. For joining us today.